The road into Prairie Bend comes in flat from the west, straight as a surveyor's line, and by the time she reached the edge of town, the sky had gone the color of old pewter. She had been walking since morning. The canvas bag cut into her shoulder through the jacket, and she had long since stopped noticing the weight the way you stop noticing a bruise. It is simply there, part of the body's daily accounting. She did not go into town. Towns at dusk have a particular quality she had learned to read. Lights coming on in kitchen windows, the smell of supper, doors closing, a kind of closing in that had nothing to do with her. She stood at the junction where the county road met the town's main street and took stock of what she could see. A grain elevator near the tracks, a water tower, a gas station with one bay lit, and farther out, beyond the last stand of cottonwoods edging the town's northern boundary, something else, a silhouette rising above the tree line, tall and cylindrical, catching the last gray light on its curved steel skin. A silo, old by the look of it, standing alone. She watched it for a moment. The wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying that particular cold she associated with weather moving fast across open country. She could smell it. Rain, still distant, but decided. The clouds in the west had gone dark at their bases, and she had nowhere to sleep. She turned off the road. The track toward the silo was not much more than 2 tire ruts pressed into the grass, and the grass had grown back tall between them, seed heads brushing her knees as she walked. The cottonwoods thinned, and then she was in open field, and the silo grew larger ahead of her with each step, larger than it had seemed from the road, easily 40 feet tall, the steel panels oxidized to a deep reddish brown, streaked with gray. It had the look of something that had stood through a great deal and was not especially interested in being noticed. Beyond it, as she came closer, she could make out the shapes of other structures. A low shed with a corrugated roof, one side bowed inward. The dark remnant of a timber barn, most of its roof caved to one side, its rafters showing like ribs. Fence posts at irregular intervals, wire long since sagged to the ground. The geometry of a farmstead, but emptied out, the way a room looks after the furniture has been removed, and you can suddenly see the walls clearly. She stopped a few feet from the silo's base and set her bag down. Up close, the steel was extraordinary. Decades of weather recorded in its surface. Rust and oxidation laid down in slow strata like a kind of sediment. Near the ground, a door. Small, hinged, with a hasp and a padlock hanging open, the shackle corroded through. The wind pushed at her back. She reached for the door. The door swung inward on a single reluctant hinge, the metal shrieking once and then going quiet. She left it open, stood in the gap and let her eyes adjust. The interior was dim but not dark. Thin seams of light entered through gaps in the upper panels, drawing pale vertical lines down the curved walls, like the markings on a measuring jar. The floor was poured concrete, cracked along 2 seams but fundamentally sound. A layer of grit and old chaff covered most of it, the debris of years settling into a kind of fine gray silt. Against the curve of the wall on one side, a workbench remained, low, bolted to the concrete, its surface warped but still fixed in place. Above it, 2 iron hooks, empty. The smell was dry and faintly metallic, with something older underneath it. Grain dust, she thought. Years of it, worked into every surface. She stepped inside and the sound changed. The wind that had been pushing at her since morning became a distant thing, reduced to a low note somewhere above. It was warmer in here than outside. Not warm, exactly, but sheltered. She did not stay long. There was more to see first. Back out in the pale afternoon, she moved methodically through the farmstead. The equipment shed she approached from the downhill side, where the corrugated wall had bowed outward under some old strain. The door, two wide panels of sheet metal on a sliding rail, had rusted into a half-open position. Inside, a riding mower with flat tires, a tangle of chain, a workbench deeper and heavier than the one in the silo, a pegboard with a few tools still hanging in their outlines, a hand cultivator, two mismatched shovels, handles gray with age but the steel not entirely gone to rust. She catalogued these carefully, the way she catalogued most things, not writing it down, but building a mental inventory, noting condition, noting usefulness, noting what was present and what was absent. The barn she approached with more caution. The roof on the east side had collapsed entirely, the old timber rafters down in a jumble of gray wood and corrugate. The west wall still stood to its full height, the boards shrunk to finger-wide gaps between them. She walked the perimeter without going in. The floor inside was part ground, part rubble. A pair of swallows shot out from somewhere in the remaining eaves and arced away over the fields. The fence lines she followed for a stretch along the northern edge of the property. The posts were still in the ground, most of them, cedar, she thought, from the color, which was why they'd lasted. The wire between them had long since given up its tension and lay in loose coils in the grass. She returned to the silo as the light was beginning to lean westward, picked up her bag, stepped inside again and pulled the door closed behind her. It held. The rain came in the night. She heard it before she felt it, a low hiss building on the plains outside, the particular sound of rainfall crossing flat ground toward you with nothing to slow it. Then it hit the silo, and the whole steel cylinder rang with it. Not loud exactly, but full. A resonant drumming that surrounded her on all sides, different from any rain she had slept through before. Rain on a tent flies thin and nervous. Rain on a car roof is close and metallic. This was something else, deep, enveloping, like being inside a bell that was being gently, continuously struck. She lay on her side with her canvas bag under her head and listened to it change pitch as the wind shifted. The floor was hard and gritty beneath her, old grain dust compressed into a crust over bare concrete. She had swept a rough patch clear before dark, using a flat piece of board she'd found near the door. Not clean, but clear enough. She'd eaten the last of a sleeve of crackers and drunk water from the bottle she always kept full. The door held. No water came in at the seam. No wind found a gap at the base. She noted this the way she noted the cedar posts, still standing in the ground, with the quiet appreciation of someone who has learned to measure shelter in units of dry and not dry. Sometime in the small hours the rain eased, and the drumming settled to a slow tick. She slept. In the morning the light came in through the door gap as a pale, level line. She opened the door, and the plains were silver and washed, the sky a high, thin white. Puddles stood in the tractor ruts. The grass smelled green and cut. She stood for a moment in the doorway, then turned back and looked at the chamber properly. It was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across. The walls curved inward above head height, and the light from the door reached maybe a third of the way across the floor before fading. The debris was manageable. A loose scatter of old wooden slats, a mound of desiccated grain chaff in the far curve of the wall, 2 rusted hopper funnels tipped on their sides, a length of steel chain coiled around nothing. Overhead, the spiral staircase rose into dimness. The floor underfoot was solid, no soft spots, no water damage that she could detect. The walls showed no rust at the seam lines. She set her bag down by the door and began to move the debris toward the entrance. It was not a plan, exactly. Plans required more certainty than she had, but she had learned to recognize when a place was trying to be useful to her, and this one was. The floor was concrete and the walls were steel, and the door closed, and the rain had not come in. That was a place to work from. She worked through that first afternoon and into the early dark, moving debris by armload to the edge of the doorway and stacking it outside against the silo's curved wall. The rusted hopper funnels were heavy enough that she had to tilt each one onto its rim and roll it. The chain she dragged outside in loops. By the time she swept the last of the chaff with a board she'd bent into a rough wedge shape, the floor was clear enough to show her what she was actually standing on. A poured concrete disc, cracked along one radius but otherwise flat and true. She ran her boot heel across it in the last of the light. Good enough. The equipment shed gave her materials. She spent the better part of 2 days in there, working through rusted wire and old canvas sheeting to reach the back wall, where she found a stack of lumber so dry it barely weighed anything. 2x8s, most of them warped but usable, some cut ends still pale inside. She found a hammer with a cracked handle she wrapped in twine. She found a coffee tin rattling with old nails. She carried it all to the silo in armloads. The sleeping platform went against the curved wall, opposite the door. She drove the first nail with more care than she expected to feel, as though the sound of it mattered. The platform came out level on 3 sides and slightly low on one corner, which she shimmed with a folded piece of tin. She padded it with the layered canvas sheeting and unrolled her bedroll on top. When she lay on it that first night, the ceiling was a perfect circle of deep blue, the open hatch at the top of the staircase showing a disk of early stars. She lay still and listened to the South Dakota wind move around the outside of the steel walls, and the silo held it away. The shelves came next. 2 runs of board, bracketed with bent angle iron from the shed, set at different heights. She put her few things on them, the tin mug, a folded cloth, a small kerosene lamp she'd found wrapped in burlap beneath a workbench. The cooking corner arranged itself in the quadrant nearest a low circular port in the wall, an old ventilation fitting she found she could remove and replace with her hands. She kept the fire small. The draft pulled cleanly. By the 4th day, she had a place where each object occupied a deliberate location, and the floor was swept each morning. She had not intended to care about that, but she did, and she noticed she did. On that 4th afternoon, she climbed the staircase for the first time. The steps were narrow, and the rail was cold, and she climbed slowly, testing each tread. At the top, she pushed open the hatch and stepped out onto the platform, and the plains opened below her in every direction, vast, straw gold, reaching without interruption to a sky so wide it seemed to lean. She stayed up there a long time. She came down from the platform with the plains still in her eyes, that particular quality of flatness, of distance without boundary, that seemed to rearrange something in the chest. She stood on the swept floor of the lower chamber and looked at what she had made of it, and for a moment the two things were one feeling, the vastness up there, the order down here, and herself the only point connecting them. The next morning she decided to scrub the floor properly. She had been sweeping it, which moved the dust around and satisfied her enough, but the surface beneath was poured concrete, and she could feel that it was sound, and she wanted to know what it actually looked like. She carried water from the creek in the dented pot she'd found in the shed, heated it on the small fire, and got down on her knees with a stiff brush she'd salvaged from a hook on the shed wall. The work was slow. The grain dust of many years had packed itself into the pores of the concrete, gone almost gray, and the brush raised a thin slurry she wiped away in sections. She worked quadrant by quadrant, rinsing the brush in a coffee tin of clean water, wetting the floor ahead and scrubbing behind. It was the kind of work that asked nothing of the mind and allowed it to drift. She was halfway through the third quadrant when the brush caught differently. Not resistance, just a slight change in the sound, a hollow quality beneath the bristles. She stopped. She wiped the wet surface with her forearm and looked. The seam was barely visible, packed with years of compacted dust, but once she saw it, she could trace the full rectangle, roughly 4 feet by 2, set into the floor at a slight angle to the wall. A maintenance hatch, heavy steel by the look of the edge. A recessed pull ring, folded flat, nearly rusted to the level of the floor itself. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a while. She tried the ring that afternoon and could not move it. The seal around the perimeter had corroded to something close to solid. She worked a flat screwdriver around the edge and felt almost nothing give. She spent the remainder of that day doing other things, restacking a shelf, oiling the door hinge with a rag and the cap from a machine oil tin she'd found, but she thought about the hatch each time she crossed the floor. The next day she went back to the equipment shed and looked more carefully at the tools remaining on the wall. She found what she needed near the back, a long pry bar with a forked end, still straight, heavy enough to matter. It took the better part of that second day, working the bar around the seam in small increments, moving and repositioning, applying steady pressure rather than force. Then, late in the afternoon, the seal broke. Cool air rose from the darkness below, dry, still, and carrying a scent she couldn't immediately name. The scent reached her before anything else did. She knelt at the open hatch and breathed it in, cool and dry and faintly resinous, like old paper and something earthy beneath it, something she eventually placed as beeswax. Not the smell of rot, not the damp smell of neglect. Whatever was down there had been sealed against time, and time had mostly obliged. She lowered the lantern first, holding it by its wire bail over the opening, and watched the light settle onto a dirt floor perhaps 8 feet below. Then she found the ladder, iron rungs driven directly into the concrete wall of the shaft, and descended carefully, one hand on the rung, one eye on the lantern swinging from her other hand. She stepped onto the floor and held the light up. The room was long and low-ceilinged, wider than she'd expected. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and unmarked. Along both sides ran wooden shelving built from heavy timber, floor to near ceiling, and on those shelves sat rows of wooden crates, small ones, each no larger than a shoebox, each one sealed at the lid with a thin bead of dark wax gone hard as stone. There were dozens of them. She counted a rough row and estimated more than she had counted. They were arranged without crowding, each one spaced from the next as though air mattered. At the far end of the room, on a central shelf set apart from the crates, sat a stack of notebooks tied together with a length of brown twine. 7 or 8 of them, she thought, bound into a single bundle like a thing that was meant to stay together. She did not rush. She brought the lantern to the central shelf and set it down. She untied the twine with careful fingers. The knot gave more easily than she expected, as though it had been tied with the intention of being untied again one day. She set the twine aside and lifted the top journal from the stack. The cover was cloth, dark green faded to gray at the spine. The handwriting inside was small and even. The letters pressed firmly into the page. A woman's hand, she thought, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She sat down on the earthen floor, the lantern beside her, the journal open in her lap, and she read. The first pages were a kind of preamble, not a diary entry, not a date and weather and what happened today, something written once, deliberately, as an explanation for whoever came after. This room was built in the summer of 1951. What is stored here is not meant for us alone. It is meant to outlast us. She read the sentence twice. The writer described the work, the digging, the pouring, the shelves her husband had built over 2 weekends in October, the care taken with each crate, the reason. She kept reading. She read until the lantern needed trimming. Then she trimmed it, adjusted the wick, and read on. The woman who had written those pages was not writing for sentiment. She was writing for utility, the precise, unsentimental utility of someone who understood that knowledge, if not recorded, simply vanishes. Variety names. Planting depths. Days to germination. Which strains held through drought and which needed reliable moisture. Which had been traded from a neighbor in 1938, which had come west in a seed tin tucked inside a coat pocket, which had been grown continuously on this exact ground for longer than the writer herself could trace. She set the first journal aside and opened the second, then the third. By the time the lantern had burned low, she understood that the crates were not a backup supply, they were a library. She began the cataloging the next morning, before the light had fully settled over the plains. She had found a composition notebook in the equipment shed, blank, miraculously dry, shoved between 2 rust-stiffened manuals, and she brought it down into the underground room along with her pencil stub and the lantern. She started at the left wall and worked right, crate by crate, lifting each packet with the same deliberate care the journals had described in their making. The packets were wrapped in cloth first, then wax paper, then tied with cotton string. Most were still sealed. She did not open them. She copied the handwritten labels into her notebook exactly as she found them. The name of the variety, the year it had been packed, and any notation added in the margins. Some had small drawings beside the name, a leaf shape, a cross-section of a root, a cluster of seeds rendered in a few careful strokes. The variety names accumulated slowly down her pages. Mortgage lifter tomato, packed 1961. Yellow pear tomato, 1958. Dragon tongue bean, 1954. Henderson's bush lima, 1949. Ford hook giant chard, 1956. A squash she had to spell twice because she wasn't sure she had it right. Varieties of corn whose names she didn't recognize at all. Varieties of melon, varieties of dry bean in colors, according to the journal, that ran from cream to near black. She had never heard of half of them. The journals filled in what the labels couldn't hold. A dragon tongue bean entry read, "Brought by Clara Meyer when she married Herman, 1931. Her mother had grown it in Minnesota. Pods yellow-streaked purple, best eaten young before they go tough. Shelled dry, they store through anything." Another entry, beneath a careful sketch of a broad, flat seed, trailed 3 years before we found the soil it wanted. Worth the patience. Worth the patience. She wrote that phrase at the top of a fresh page and left it there while she kept working. By afternoon, she had opened 14 crates, 31 varieties catalogued, each one trailing a small history behind it, like thread from a spool. She was nowhere near finished. The last crate was heavier than the rest. She had been moving through the underground room methodically for days, opening, cataloging, closing, and she had learned to read the crates by feel. The lighter ones held seed packets nested in sawdust. The midweight ones held journals. The heaviest ones held both. This one held neither. When she lifted the lid, she found a single oilcloth bundle tied with kitchen twine, and inside it, rolled flat and protected from the decades by the cloth and the dry, cold air of the room, were the maps. 4 of them. Large sheets of drafting paper, hand-drawn in faded blue ink, each one covering a different section of the surrounding land. Topographic lines, field boundaries, well locations, notations in a small, careful hand she had come to recognize as the man's, more precise, less given to story than the woman's entries. She spread the largest map across the floor and held her lantern over it. The irrigation channels were marked in a double blue line, like a river drawn in shorthand. They branched from what appeared to be a main intake on the property's north edge, fed by a seasonal creek she had not yet walked to, and spread outward in a shallow fan across the fields before looping back along the eastern fence line. Beside each branch, small annotations. Depth 18 in, clay-lined, 1947, rerouted. One channel ran directly alongside the silo and continued south toward the flattest section of the field. The section where the soil looked different, she now realized, darker and less compacted than the rest. She had noticed it weeks ago and not known why. She folded the largest map carefully and tucked it into her jacket. Outside, the morning was low and gray and windless. She walked the field slowly, watching the ground. She had learned something from the journals without quite meaning to. Patience as a form of attention. She stopped, where the soil changed color, and crouched down and pressed her fingers into it. Softer. The kind of softness that meant something had moved through it, repeatedly, over years. She found the channel depression 20 minutes later. Overgrown, partially collapsed in 2 places, the clay lining cracked, but largely intact. She walked its full length, kicking aside grass clumps, mapping it against the paper map in her hand. The intake end was choked with silt and root matter. The outlet end had held its form almost perfectly. She went back to the equipment shed. The spade was old but solid. So was the mattock. She carried them out to the intake end of the channel and stood there for a moment looking at the plugged earth. Then she put the blade in. The work was harder than she had expected and slower than she had hoped. She worked until the light failed the first day, and she worked the entire next day and the day after that. Her palms blistered. She let them. By the 4th day she had cleared the intake and opened 2 of the collapsed sections. By the 6th day the channel ran uninterrupted for its full length. On the morning of the 7th day she diverted a small flow from the creek, tentative, a trickle, and walked beside it as it moved, haltingly at first, then with more certainty, along the channel toward the dark-soiled field beside the silo. Water found its level. It always did. She stood and watched it go. She stood at the end of the channel for a long time after the water found its way through, not celebrating, just watching. The trickle moved along the cut earth with a kind of quiet persistence that felt, in its small way, like proof of something. The field beside the silo was a rectangle of heavy, dark soil, maybe 30 feet by 40. She had turned a portion of it earlier in the week, working the mattock through the crust and breaking up the dry clods underneath. Now she went back to that turned earth with the water running in the channel beside it, and she knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the surface, cold, still holding moisture from the night. She cupped her hands and let a small amount of channel water soak into the loosest patch near the edge. She had spent 3 evenings before this reading. The journals were careful about sequence. Plant after the last killing frost, one entry read, in careful penciled script. Work bone meal into beds where it can be had. Water at the base, never overhead. The handwriting belonged to a woman who had thought seriously about soil. She went back to the underground room and chose her first seeds with the same seriousness. Not by what she recognized almost nothing, but by what the journals said was forgiving of new ground, a dry climate tomato with a long German name she could not pronounce. 2 varieties of squash, one bred for thin skin, one for storage. A legume, the journal called simply the purple climber. A dense-headed sunflower, the notes described as a seed crop rather than a cut flower. And a border row of something the journal listed as good for the bees and for the nose, its small paper packet labeled in faded ink. She planted in rows the journal specified, spaced according to the penciled diagrams. She tamped each furrow by hand, pressing the earth without compacting it, the way the journal said. Then she ran a slow, shallow flow from the channel along the base of each row, and walked away. It took 3 weeks. She almost stopped watching for it, which was probably why she finally saw it. A smudge of green at the edge of the row nearest the silo wall, so faint it might have been shadow. Then another, slightly paler. Then 6 in a line. She crouched down until her face was level with the soil. The seedlings were nothing yet. Pale stems, 2 leaves each, smaller than her thumbnail, but they had pushed through on their own. The soil had held what she gave it. She did not know what most of them would become. The journals did. She went back inside to read. She noticed the truck slow down before she heard it. The road ran along the section line a 1/4 mile east of the silo, and she had grown accustomed to its small sounds. Gravel pop, the occasional engine note fading toward Prairie Bend. This one did not fade. It idled. She straightened from the row she was thinning and looked. A faded blue pickup had stopped at the shoulder, and someone was standing beside it with one hand shading their eyes. She did not wave. She waited. The truck moved on. 2 days later it came back. This time it turned down the access track. She set her trowel down and stood, brushing soil from her knees. By the time the pickup reached the equipment shed, she had decided to be still and let the conversation come to her on its own terms. The woman who climbed out was perhaps 60, lean in the way of someone who had worked outdoors for most of her life. She wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt faded to the color of old straw. She stopped a short distance from the garden rows and looked at them the way a person looks at something that does not quite match what they expected to find. She said she had seen the smoke. She said word had gotten around Prairie Bend that someone was living out at the Halverson place, and she admitted she had driven past twice already before deciding to stop. The young woman acknowledged this without comment. She was guarded, not unfriendly, and she let the silence sit until the older woman's eyes moved from her face back to the garden. She offered to walk her through the rows. They moved along the outer border, and she named what she could from the journal entries, pointing out the climber stretching thin tendrils toward the wire she had strung along the shed wall, the dense-headed grain sunflowers, the low border plants whose small furled leaves she still could not fully identify. The older woman moved slowly, crouching once, lifting a leaf with 2 careful fingers. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said she knew this plant. She said her own grandmother had grown it in a kitchen garden outside a farmhouse that had been gone for 30 years now. She had not seen it anywhere since. She looked up. She asked where it had come from. The young woman looked at the small border row, its leaves catching the late light, and felt something she had not expected. Not pride exactly, but a recognition that what was growing here was not only hers. It had come from somewhere. It had been kept. She said she had found some journals. She said there was quite a lot to show her, if she had time. The older woman stayed another hour, walking the irrigation channel with her, asking careful questions she could not always fully answer. When she left, she pressed her hand briefly over the young woman's and said she hoped things worked out. The young woman watched the car turn onto the main road and disappear into the flat distance. She went back inside and sat at her small table until the light went. He came on a Tuesday. She heard the truck before she saw it, a low diesel rumble carrying across the still morning air, growing steadily louder than anything passing traffic would account for. She was already outside when the dusty pickup turned off the road and came slowly up the track toward the gate, its tires pressing dark lines into the dry grass. It stopped. He sat in the cab for a moment before he got out. He was older than she had pictured, a lean man with a weathered face and a deliberate way of moving, the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from long habit. He looked at the silo, he looked at the garden, he looked at her. She did not wait for him to speak first. She walked to the gate and opened it, and told him she had been expecting him, more or less. She asked him to come inside. He followed her without saying much, his eyes tracking everything: the swept threshold, the shelves she had built, the neat stacks of journals arranged by decade, the hand-drawn map of the irrigation channels pinned beside the agreement she had not yet signed with anyone. She set the kettle on the camp stove and poured coffee into the cup she had carved a notch into so it always sat level on the uneven floor. She set it in front of him and sat across the table. Then she opened the first journal and placed it between them. She had thought, in the days before this, about what she would say. She had rehearsed small explanations, reasonable arguments for her presence, careful framings of the work she had done. But when the moment came, she said none of those things. She only turned the pages slowly, pointing out the entries that had guided her, the channel measurements, the seed notes written in two distinct hands, the small pressed specimens tucked inside back covers. He had not spoken. He was looking down at the open journal with an expression she could not read. She turned to the third entry in the second volume, where the handwriting changed, looping, unhurried, careful, and watched his face as he saw it. His hand moved to the page but did not touch it. He said her name was his grandmother's, not her name, the handwriting's name. He said he had not seen it since he was a boy, since a birthday card she had sent him the winter before she died, and he had forgotten the shape of it, the particular slant, until this moment. He said this quietly, almost to himself, as though he were noting a measurement. She did not reply. She let the journal stay open between them and drank her coffee and listened to the wind move across the top of the silo far above. They talked for 2 days. Not urgently, the way you talk when neither person is in a hurry and the subject is too large for hurrying. He walked with her along the restored channel, crouching at the inlet she had rebuilt with packed clay and salvaged angle iron, running his thumb along the seam where the water still moved, slow and steady, through soil that had been dry for decades. He walked through the garden without speaking, stopping at the bed of heritage squash she had started from the oldest packets, at the dense row of blue flint corn that was only knee-high but already unmistakable. On the morning of the second day, he sat at the small table again and drafted the agreement by hand on a sheet of plain paper he had brought in from his truck. It did not take long to write. It was plain language: caretaker of the farmstead, steward of the seed collection, tenant of the silo in exchange for her labor and care. No complicated terms. He slid it across the table. She read it twice, slowly, in the careful way she had learned to read anything that mattered. She signed it. She used the same pen she had used to mark her irrigation maps, the one with the slightly scratchy nib that left a line slightly thicker than she intended. She folded her copy once, neatly, and he took his without ceremony and tucked it into his breast pocket. Then she found the last tack in the tin on the shelf and pinned her copy to the wall beside the hand-drawn irrigation map, and stood back and looked at it. That evening, she climbed the spiral staircase to the observation platform at the top of the silo. The sun was going down over the plains in long horizontal bands of copper and pale yellow, the kind of light that makes the land look both very old and very new at once. She sat on the platform with her legs hanging over the edge and her hands wrapped around her knees, and watched it until the last of it was gone. She had passed through hundreds of places. This one she would stay.